Hello, and welcome to this short introduction to the Gospel of Mark. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Geoffrey and I'm the minister of Putney and Roehampton Methodist Churches. And I'm recording this video to provide a brief introduction to our series of Bible studies on Sunday evenings, via Zoom of course, looking at the Gospel of Mark. The plan is that we'll work our way through the entirety of the Gospel in the coming weeks, looking at some of the stories and all of the chapters and thinking about what it has to say to us today and what it said in its original context. Before we plunge into that study though, we, the people who lead the study with me, thought it might be helpful just to record a very short introduction to answer some key questions about the Gospel. Now, when we think about any book, especially any biblical book, we might begin by asking three simple questions. Who wrote it? When did they write it? Where did they write it? And the answer to those questions is very simple for Mark. We don't really know. We don't really know. We don't really know. That might lead, well, that's the end of the video. Hope that was helpful. No. That might immediately lead us on to three more questions. Why don't we know? What do we know? How can we trust this gospel? Well, to answer the first question, why don't we know? Well, it seems very hard for us to understand how we could not know who wrote this book. We live in a world where copyright and authorship are very, very important, and people are very keen to exercise their rights over their published material. We're putting this on YouTube, and we live in dread on YouTube of being told off or fined or having our account blocked because we've inadvertently infringed somebody else's copyright. If you've ever written any sort of academic essay, you will know that you have to be very careful about citing your sources in footnotes and bibliographies and things. And if you don't, you're guilty of plagiarism and you get into real trouble. So coming from that world, it's very hard for us to imagine a world where authorship didn't really matter. Now that's not quite true, because in the world of the New Testament, it was important for people to know who wrote material, and the person writing often gave authority to their writing. So for example, Paul's letters, it was important that people knew they came from Paul himself. But in the case of Mark, and really the other Gospels as well to some extent, the Gospel writers weren't the important people. It was Jesus. It was their subject matter that was the key important thing. And it was what they wrote that was more important. And they didn't want the focus to be on themselves, even if it could have been. So the issue of who wrote it wasn't quite as crucial as it is today. And certainly in the texts we have, there's no handy author's photograph and blurb at the back saying, if you've enjoyed this book by Mark, you might enjoy some of his other works. So the text we have in our Bibles today doesn't tell us who Mark is. And it doesn't tell us where he wrote it or when he wrote it. Other texts do. So for example, the book of Revelation, the book itself tells us it was written by a man called John on the island of Patmos. And I'm here in front of my map to help me, the island of Patmos in Greece. That leads us to our second question. What do we know about Mark? Well, the answer is a fair bit, and that comes to us in a variety of ways. First of all, there's material outside the Gospel that we often refer to as the tradition, or perhaps we might say the church fathers or the early church historians who were writing in the centuries after Jesus and whom many Christians would regard as providing a great deal of authoritative information. People like Irenaeus and later Augustine. And a man called Papias tells us that the Gospel of Mark was associated with a man called Mark, who was very closely associated, perhaps we might say a secretary or a companion to the Apostle Peter, and that he wrote his works in Rome. And we know that there was an important Christian community very early on in the years after Jesus' death and resurrection. Now, whether that is the case, we're not completely sure, and scholars and commentators take very different views on this, because some say, well, there isn't enough evidence to support that conclusion, and others say there is. The identity of Mark is confused as well, because some people identify it with some of the Marks referred to in the New Testament, and we find reference to Mark and somebody called John Mark in Acts and Colossians and other parts of the New Testament. But that is confused by the fact that Mark is one of the most common names at this time in the ancient world. So what we can what historians and commentators have done is to use the evidence from the text. So not explicit, as we said, it doesn't say anywhere Mark wrote this in Rome, but there are clues within the text that we can take out. So for example, the language that is used. So it's written in Greek, a kind of Greek called Koine Greek, which was the common language of most of the Eastern Mediterranean at this time, and is the language in which the New Testament is written. It's a very direct style of Greek. It's not as flowery, we might say, as Luke, for example, who was writing in quite a more advanced state. You might say if he was writing in English, he was more literary. Luke was. Mark is a very direct, a limited vocabulary, and he gets his message across very clearly. But within that language, he seems to include some Latin loan words, and he seems to know Aramaic, which was the language that Jesus and people in Palestine spoke. And I'll try to stop looking like a weatherman too much, like pushing this across. So that provides some clues to the language that he uses. His knowledge, what he knows and doesn't know, and what he assumes that his audience know and don't know. So sometimes it's often referred to the fact that Mark makes mistakes with his geography in Palestine. He sometimes seems to get a little confused. So that makes some people think that perhaps he was writing away from Palestine. But then some of the times he seems to use words that indicate that he was in Palestine. So for example, and there's a close-up over here, we're very familiar with the Sea of Galilee if we've read our Bibles. But actually, of course, Galilee is not a sea, it's a lake. Mark refers to it as a sea, which indicates that he perhaps knew it better and he was using local expressions, whereas Luke never refers to it as a sea because he clearly thinks it's too small to be called a sea. There's also, Mark refers to a woman as a Syro-Phoenician woman, and lots of debate about that. Does that tell us that he was writing away or writing near to to Palestine? And you can argue it both ways. There are little clues in the text that some people have taken. So Rowan Williams, in his commentary or his notes on Mark, points out that when Mark talks about Simon of Cyrene taking Jesus' cross, he refers to two people called Alexander and Rufus from Cyrene. Cyrene here on the North African coast. And he seems to assume that the people he's writing for in the first instance will know these people. So does that tell us something or not? And there's also the references that he seems to be alluding to. Is he alluding to events of his own time? And when it comes to the question of timing, the allusions within the sections where Jesus is talking about the end times and the destruction of Jerusalem, is he referring, does Mark assume that he's referring to events of Mark's own time, and in particular the crucial events around 70 AD when the Romans destroyed the temple, and the years before that when there was a Jewish revolt and a war? Now, if you take all that information together, you get a lot of commentaries, you get a lot of discussion, and you get a lot of opposing views. And that's why I say we don't really know, because people can argue very convincingly from the same evidence for different viewpoints. What we could if we're trying to sort of bring it together to say what do we know, we think that Mark, whoever Mark was, and he probably was one of the characters referred to in the New Testament, quite probably, and he probably knew Peter in some respects. He could have been writing quite easily in Rome, or he could have been writing in Antioch. He was probably writing around the late 60s AD. I'm going to stick my neck out there. Perhaps in the years just before or just after the culmination of the Jewish revolt, so late 60s, early 70s AD, so around 30, 40 years after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus. And in his gospel, he seems to be thinking in his head when he's writing down what he's saying about some of the events, perhaps, of the Jewish revolt and what happened subsequently. Now, beyond that, it's quite hard to say. He almost certainly was writing for all Christians, as he would have known them. There was a long time where people thought that the gospel writers were writing for specific communities, like Paul wrote his letters to specific Christian churches, the church in Corinth, the church in Ephesus, and so often dealt with very specific matters. But nowadays, commentators and historians and Christians would emphasize the way in which the churches of the early church were very closely connected, and how there was regular correspondence between them, people and documents travelling regularly. And one commentator liked to use the expression the holy internet to describe the way that these churches were linked. And if you can see on the map behind me, they're slightly faint, the different lines refer to the missionary journeys of St. Paul, and you may have seen that in a map or in the back of your Bibles. And we might like to think of those lines and other lines as being like the routes of the internet going from different place to a different place. And many of them were common sea routes and land routes, of course Roman roads, meaning that the communities were connected. And that Mark was writing his gospel not just for a very small church, not just for the people he knew, but for all Christians everywhere, to provide them with important information about Jesus. And we know that his gospel spread very quickly across the Eastern Mediterranean and was copied and was very quickly accepted. That leaves us the third question, and perhaps the most important. How can we trust this information? How can we trust this gospel if I'm not able to tell you emphatically, this is who wrote it, this is when they wrote it, this is where they wrote it, this is why they wrote it? Well, we can trust it because of the way in which the Gospels were accepted and adopted by the early church. And one of the great mistakes that I often hear is that the New Testament was put together by committee. Now, in Methodism, we're very familiar with committees, and some of us may have our doubts about the way that committees work. It didn't work like that. Eventually, a church council, several centuries after the time of Jesus, put a seal and stamp on the New Testament, said these books are good and trustworthy. But what they were doing was simply confirming a process that took place several centuries beforehand and took place quite rapidly. And that is whereby the Christian churches, and as I said, these Christian churches who are linked, we're pretty sure, very closely together, exercised their authority to select which texts they thought were important. We would use the word canonical now. Which texts were important and which were not. And they were doing this not on the basis of just like, oh, well, I like this or I don't like that, or I like that story and I don't like that story. They were judging them against the evidence they had. And we know that the first Christians had a lot of evidence. They knew what they were talking about because some of them would have encountered Jesus himself, and some of the first readers of Mark would have seen Jesus, heard him preach, perhaps witnessed his death or resurrection. They would have encountered people who had been direct eyewitnesses. And what we know is that very soon after the resurrection and ascension of Jesus, people travelled from Jerusalem to bring the good news of Jesus to other communities. Most famously, Peter and Paul, but other disciples as well. They travelled round, and as Methodists, we might see it, perhaps in a slightly convoluted, biased way, as a sort of early circuit. We're familiar with the idea of circuit and preachers going round. And we know that disciples and people who knew Jesus and had encountered Jesus travelled round telling stories to the early churches. And the churches, which were very small in places like Colossae and Corinth, 30, 40, 50 people would gather round, and this visitor would arrive, and for days and weeks they would sit and they would tell the stories. So already, by the time Mark wrote his gospel, people knew the stories of Jesus. They knew what Jesus had done. They knew some of the things he taught and said. They certainly knew the events of his death and resurrection, and they had a very clear idea of the order in which that took place. And we can see that because in all our gospels, that order is there present. And there also would have been written documents, some written documents. We're not sure about those because those have not survived. But there would have been collections of sayings and stories of Jesus written down. So when this Gospel of Mark arrived in a church somewhere in the Eastern Mediterranean, people weren't saying, "Oh, good heavens, this is new. Who is this Jesus person?" They were able to compare what Mark had written with all the information they already had about Jesus. And they were able to say, yes, this work corresponds with what we know about Jesus. And it brings it together in a new and interesting format. And clearly it was a bestseller, Mark, because it survived and flourished. But it contains what we know, and we can recognize this Jesus. And we know they did this because we know they rejected some material. And in material, I'll just go and get it. This book, sits on my bookshelf, it's called the Apocryphal New Testament. This contains what we might say the rejects from the New Testament. This contains the Gospels, Acts, letters, and other narratives that were written by people in the early years after Christ, in the first couple of centuries. But the early church, using that same criterion, does this look like Jesus, said, no, we don't believe this. We don't recognize this Jesus, and we are not going to use these texts. Now, sometimes we find these texts quite helpful, and we find that they contain sayings that we do believe go back to the time of Jesus. But as a whole, they were rejected by the early church. So we know that the first Christians were very discerning listeners, very discerning people who could say, this is reliable, this is not. And as part of that process would have been who wrote it. And it's important to say that when Christians received that text first time, they would have known who wrote it. They would have known which Mark it was, and they would have trusted them. But as I said, for them, it wasn't important that who Mark was, and that's why they didn't record that information in detail. It was important that the text was reliable. So for me, as a Christian, as a preacher, and as a historian, that gives a great deal of confidence in this Gospel of Mark, because it tells us that the people who really knew, who knew far more than we do about Jesus, saw Mark's Gospel, read it and said, yes, this is the Jesus we know and recognise. And there's also lots of other reasons that we should have confidence in our Gospels. As I said, that date, probably written around 70 AD, a few years before, a few years after. Now that's, if we assume that Jesus died somewhere between 30 and 36 AD, that's 35, 40 years after the death and resurrection and ascension of Jesus. Now we might think that's a bit far, a bit distant. Now, of course, we have to remember that there was the oral tradition, there was people preserving the stories and sayings and deeds of Jesus. And we know that in pre-literate societies, in societies where people can't really read and write, people are much better at remembering stories accurately. So we should rely on that oral tradition. I always give the example in this context of phone numbers. I grew up in a pre-digital age, and I can still remember my phone number as a child and the phone numbers of several of my best friends at school. Today, I can barely remember my own phone number because I don't have to, because I've got it on my phone. So we know that in societies where people don't read and write, they're much better at remembering things. So that gap was covered by the oral tradition. It was covered by some written sources as well. But it's actually very short, in terms of ancient history, very short, the distance between putting pen to paper and the events describing. I just took a book at random from my bookshelf, and this is Arrian, another ancient writer, writing about Alexander the Great. And he, of course, Alexander the Great, one of the great figures of history, statues, pictures, all the rest of it. Nobody questions really that Alexander the Great existed or did lots of impressive things. But Arrian, who is the principal source for histories of Alexander the Great and his time, the principal, most important source, wrote 400 years after Alexander the Great's death. Now, he too would have been relying on sources that no longer exist. But think of that massive gap. 400 years between death and writing, 40 years. So there's already an important difference. And there's also the fact that we have such good textual records for our New Testament. We have far more copies. We don't have Mark's original autographed copy of Mark. Very sadly, we don't have him writing at the end, "This is it, first edition, put it on eBay." But we do have copies of copies very close to the time. So the earliest copy of Mark is in the Chester Beatty Library, called Papyrus 45, and it was written, it dates back to the early 2nd century. So within a century and a half or so of the original being written. And that, compared to most ancient history, Julius Caesar, Tacitus, Herodotus, all those, is so much better. So much, it gives us so much more confidence in the text. So for these and lots of other reasons, we can have confidence, great confidence in Mark's Gospel, even though we are not able to answer those specific questions. And what I'd always say to people is that as Christians, as Methodist Christians, or whatever tradition we're coming from, we are required to believe certain things, even though we may doubt them on some days. We're required to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. We're required to believe in the Trinity and various other things. We are not required to believe that Mark, a particular Mark, wrote Mark's Gospel. If you look at the evidence and you decide that the papyrus was right and it was a particular Mark associated with Peter, that's absolutely fine, and nobody can question you and nobody can say you are wrong. But if you want to say, well, it's a Mark, we don't know and we're not sure where he wrote in Antioch or wherever, then that's also fine as well, and nobody can really say you are wrong. What is important is that we can trust in the Gospel of Mark. We can trust in its message, and we can trust and believe in someone who was so keen for us to hear this good news about Jesus, who thought it was so important that he spent a great deal of time, effort and money, and we should recognise that Gospels took a lot of money to write down because of the cost of the materials in the ancient world. It took a lot of time, effort and money so that we today could hear the good news of Jesus Christ. And that's particularly so in Mark. Mark, who edits out so much extraneous detail. Very frustratingly for historians and scholars, with so much more we'd like to know about when Jesus did certain things, or where he did it, or what the weather was like, or what was happening in the world around. Mark cuts all that out and he goes straight to the word of Jesus. What was Jesus doing? What was Jesus saying? Because for Mark, that was the good news. That was what was important. Not him. It was Jesus who was the important thing, because he was good news for all people everywhere. And that is as true then as it is today. Well, I hope that's been sort of helpful. We can discuss all these questions more in detail as we go through the book, and the questions will come up as we come to particular chapters and stories. But I hope you might be able to join us, even if it's just for 1 or 2 sessions, wherever you're coming from, whatever you're doing. And if you would like to join us, just drop me an email and I'll send you the Zoom link. Whatever the year holds for you, I hope you'll be happy and blessed, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.